In the gaslit world of mid-19th century New York City, a boy named Theodore Roosevelt spent much of his childhood confined by the pane of a window. Born into a family of comfortable means, his early years were not defined by the vigorous outdoor pursuits one might associate with his later legend, but by a fragile constitution that left him gasping for air. Severe asthma attacks would descend without warning, transforming the simple act of breathing into a desperate, wheezing struggle. The world outside his home on East 20th Street was a bustling, vibrant metropolis, but for young T.D., as his family called him, it often felt like a distant panorama viewed from a place of enforced stillness. His chest would tighten, a fearful whistling sound escaping his lips, and his parents would rush to his side, their faces etched with a concern that became a familiar backdrop to his youth. In these moments, the wide world contracted to the four walls of his room, and his greatest adventure was the journey from his bed to the window seat, where he would press his forehead against the cool glass, watching other children run and play in the open air, a participant only through observation. This physical limitation, however, did not imprison his mind. In fact, it may have been the very crucible that forged his formidable intellect and indomitable will. Denied the outlet of physical exertion, he turned inward and toward the boundless realms of books and ideas. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a man of great energy and moral conviction, would gently but firmly encourage this scholarly pursuit, building a small gymnasium on the home's porch to gently coax strength into his son's frail body, but also filling the house with books on every conceivable subject. The boy devoured tales of adventure, natural history, and military exploits, his imagination traveling to far corners of the globe even as his body remained tethered. His mother, Mitty, a Southern belle with a gift for storytelling, would regale him with narratives that sparked his sense of romance and drama. This dichotomy between a frail body and a ferociously active mind became the central conflict of his boyhood. He would later write of these years with a clarity born of reflection, describing how the attacks filled him with a dreadful feeling of weakness and helplessness. Yet, even then, a spark of defiance was being kindled. The window was not merely a barrier. It became a frame through which he studied the world he was determined to one day join. He began to meticulously catalog the birds he saw in the backyard, starting a lifelong passion for ornithology, writing detailed notes in a childish hand about sparrows and starlings. His father's admonition that he would have to build his own body began to take root, not as a chore, but as a moral imperative. Thus began a determined, often painful, regimen of exercise. He lifted weights, he boxed, he embarked on long, strenuous walks, pushing through the dizziness and the gasps, building muscle and lung capacity through sheer force of will. The sickly boy at the window was, in these quiet, stubborn acts of self-creation, laying the foundation for the robust man of action he would become. It was a slow and arduous metamorphosis, witnessed only by his family and the silent panes of glass that once symbolized his limitations. This period taught him a fundamental lesson that would echo throughout his life, that courage is not the absence of fear or weakness, but the triumph over it. The dignified struggle in that New York City townhouse was his first great campaign, a private war against his own physiology, and its successful conclusion gave him an unshakable belief in the power of the will to reshape destiny. He learned to stare down the specter of helplessness and to answer its challenge with disciplined action, a template he would later apply to political opponents, national crises, and treacherous river rapids alike. After the devastating one-two punch of losing both his mother and his beloved wife, Alice, on the same dark day in 1884, Theodore Roosevelt felt the structured world of New York politics and society crumble into meaningless fragments. Grief, profound and disorienting, hollowed him out. The man known for his boundless energy found himself adrift in a fog of sorrow, the bustling corridors of the New York State Assembly now feeling like a cage. It was in this state of desolation that he turned westward, answering a call that was both escapist and deeply necessary. He arrived in the Dakota Badlands, a stark, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape that seemed to mirror the raw geography of his own heart. Here, Beneath an immense sky that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single obstruction, he encountered a world defined by elemental truths. The air was clean and sharp, scented with sage and dust, a stark contrast to the coal smoke and perfume of the east. He invested in 2 cattle ranches, the Elkhorn and the Maltese Cross, and set about the arduous task of learning a completely new way of life. To the seasoned cowboys, he was an amusing spectacle at first, the bespectacled, talkative dude from New York with his Harvard accent and peculiar exclamations of bully. But Roosevelt approached ranching with the same intense curiosity and physical determination he had once applied to conquering his asthma. He learned to ride, not with the polished grace of a gentleman rider, but with the practical, enduring skill of a working cowboy, spending long days in the saddle under the relentless sun. He learned to rope and brand cattle, his hands growing rough and calloused. He participated in the spring roundup, a weeks-long, gritty operation of dust, sweat, and driven cattle, sleeping on the hard ground with his saddle for a pillow, waking with frost on his blankets. The physical exhaustion was a kind of medicine, a purgative for the soul. In the vast silence of the Badlands, broken only by the wind and the lowing of cattle, his personal tragedy began to recede from a sharp, immediate pain to a permanent, but bearable, scar within him. The land itself was a teacher. He studied its dramatic geology, the fantastically eroded buttes, the layered strata-telling eons of history. He observed its wildlife with the keen eye of a naturalist, tracking elk, observing prairie dog towns, and learning the habits of the formidable grizzly bear. He faced genuine danger, once chasing boat thieves for days down the freezing Little Missouri River, an episode that showcased his gritty resolve and sense of frontier justice. The people of the West, too, reshaped his understanding of America. He developed a deep respect for the cowboys, miners, and hunters, men of few words, but direct action, whose character was tested daily by hardship. He saw in them the vitality and independence he believed were the bedrock of the nation. This period was far from a pastoral idyll. A brutal winter in 1886-87 decimated his herds and wiped out his financial investment. Yet, he never considered the venture a failure. As he would later write, the West had given him more than it took. It had restored him. It had taken the refined, grieving Eastern politician and remade him into a figure of resilient frontier vigor, a synthesis that would define his public image. The man who returned east was not the same man who had left. He carried with him the imprint of the open sky, a newfound simplicity of purpose, and a visceral connection to the American wilderness that would later fuel his most enduring legacy. The Badlands did not just offer him solace. They provided him with a foundational myth, a personal narrative of renewal through struggle against the raw elements of nature and self, which he would skillfully weave into the fabric of his own legend and his vision for the American spirit. When Theodore Roosevelt moved his family into the White House in 1901, the staid mansion underwent a transformation not seen before or since. It was not merely the home of the first family. It became, in his own delighted words, a bully pulpit for his policies and a gloriously chaotic playground for his 6 vibrant children. The corridors that had echoed with formal diplomacy now rang with the shrieks and laughter of what the public affectionately called the White House Gang. Roosevelt, who believed deeply in what he termed the strenuous life, encouraged his children's exuberance, seeing in their antics the healthy vitality of a robust nation. His second wife, Edith, served as the graceful, steadying center of this delightful storm, managing the household with a quiet efficiency and dry wit that perfectly complemented her husband's boundless energy. The children, however, were the undisputed stars of this domestic theater. Quentin, the youngest, was perhaps the most infamous, leading charges down the hallways, inviting pet shop ponies into the elevator for rides to the second floor, and once famously selling tickets to his father's press conferences from the gates of the White House. His older brothers, Ted, Kermit, and Archie, were equally spirited, engaging in pillow fights, constructing elaborate obstacle courses, and bringing an ever-changing menagerie of pets into the residence. The The list of animal inhabitants became legendary. Algonquin the pony, Eli Yale the blue macaw, Josiah the badger, a one-legged rooster, a small bear, and countless dogs, cats, guinea pigs, and snakes. The sight of the President of the United States patiently calling for his children's pet kangaroo rat to be returned to its cage was not an uncommon one. Alice, Roosevelt's daughter from his first marriage, was a force of nature in her own right. A stylish and sharp-witted young woman, she carved her own path through Washington society, often delighting in mild mischief that kept the Capitol gossiping. Roosevelt reveled in it all. He was a devoted, hands-on father who would drop affairs of state for a wrestling match or to listen to a child's tale of adventure. He read to them nightly, took them on vigorous hikes and swims, and instilled in them his own codes of honesty, courage, and public service. The famous incident where Archie, sick with measles, was cheered up by his brothers smuggling the family pony up the White House elevator to his sick room was a story Roosevelt told with immense pride, not embarrassment. This lively domesticity was not separate from his presidency, it was woven into its public image. The American people, through newspaper reports and photographs, came to know and adore this energetic, unconventional first family. They saw a president who was not a remote statesman, but a human being, a father who understood the simple joys and trials of family life. This humanized him in a profound way, making his progressive political agenda, often called the Square Deal, seem more relatable, rooted in a concern for the everyday American household. The White House, under the Roosevelts, became a symbol of wholesome, vigorous American life. It was a place where policy was debated in the Oval Office while, just down the hall, a child might be racing a pet lizard. This unique atmosphere perfectly reflected Roosevelt's own philosophy, that a full life required both serious purpose and untamed joy, that national strength was built on individual character, and that character was best forged in the loving, rambunctious, and occasionally messy crucible of family. Theodore Roosevelt's popular image was that of the Rough Rider, the man who spoke softly but carried a big stick. Yet, his greatest diplomatic achievement, the brokering of the 1905 Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War, was a masterclass in the power of the softly spoken word, relentless patience, and nuanced understanding. The conflict, fought over imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea, had dragged on for over a year, exhausting both mighty empires. Japan, though winning stunning victories, was financially drained. Russia, reeling from military defeats and internal unrest, was stubbornly reluctant to admit defeat. Into this stalemate stepped Roosevelt, not as a combatant, but as a facilitator. His invitation for delegates from both nations to meet in the quiet shipbuilding town of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was a stroke of diplomatic stagecraft, removing the talks from the pressure cooker environments of European capitals. The negotiations, conducted through the sweltering summer of 1905, were painstaking and fraught. The Japanese, represented by the formidable Baron Komura, arrived demanding a large indemnity and significant territorial concessions, including the island of Sakhalin. The Russians, led by Count Sergei Witte, were prepared to concede much, but the demand for cash reparations was a bitter pill, seen as an affront to national pride that Tsar Nicholas II would not swallow. Roosevelt's role was that of a subtle intermediary, a persistent but respectful go-between. He met separately with each delegation in the relaxed settings of his summer home or on presidential yacht cruises, building personal rapport. He understood that beyond the legal and territorial claims, this was a negotiation about saving face and securing a durable peace that would stabilize the balance of power in Asia, which he believed served American interests. He cajoled, he flattered, he appealed to reason and to the long-term benefits of peace. In dozens of carefully crafted letters and cables, he nudged the parties closer together, explaining one side's intransigence to the other, suggesting compromises. The critical breakthrough came on the issue of the indemnity. Roosevelt, sensing it was the immovable object, tirelessly worked the back channels. He persuaded the Japanese to drop their demand for cash and, in return, pushed the Russians to agree to cede the southern half of Sakhalin Island. It was a classic Rooseveltian compromise. Each side gave something, each side gained something, and pride was preserved. When the treaty was finally signed on September 5, 1905, the world breathed a sigh of relief. For his pivotal role, Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the following year, becoming the first American to win the award. He accepted it with characteristic humility and a clear-eyed view of diplomacy, noting that peace itself was a form of strenuous achievement. The Portsmouth negotiations revealed a side of Roosevelt often overshadowed by his more bellicose rhetoric, the shrewd analyst of international power, the patient negotiator who understood that true strength often lies in the ability to forge agreement without firing a shot. He demonstrated that the big stick of American influence was most effective when used not to threaten, but to create a space where rivals could, with dignity, lay down their arms. Amidst the roar of political campaigns and the clamor of international diplomacy, Theodore Roosevelt found his deepest sense of peace and purpose in the silent, ancient cathedrals of the American wilderness. His conservation legacy was not born in a single dramatic act, but cultivated over a lifetime of quiet walks, careful observation, and a profound philosophical belief that the nation's character was tied to the health of its land. This was not a mere hobby for a president, it was a central pillar of his patriotism. His love for nature, first nurtured by his sickly childhood studies of birds, was tempered and deepened by his years in the Badlands, where he saw both the sublime beauty and the terrifying fragility of ecosystems. As president, he wielded executive power with unprecedented vigor to protect these treasures, seeing himself not as an owner, but as a steward for future generations. He famously embarked on a camping trip in 1903 with the great naturalist John Muir in the Yosemite Valley, where under the towering sequoias and star-filled skies, Muir's passionate advocacy for pure wilderness preservation met Roosevelt's pragmatic conservationist vision, which included wise use of resources. That trip solidified Roosevelt's resolve. Using the authority of the recently passed Antiquities Act, he proclaimed 18 national monuments, protecting wonders like the Grand Canyon and Devil's Tower from immediate exploitation. He more than doubled the number of national parks, creating 5 new ones, and established the first 51 federal bird reserves, the precursors to the National Wildlife Refuge System. Perhaps most significantly, he created the United States Forest Service and placed 150 million acres of forest land under federal protection, managed for sustainable use. Each of these actions was preceded by what he loved most, personal inspection. He would escape Washington whenever possible, not for leisure, but for earnest fieldwork. He would walk for miles through forests, noting tree species and animal signs. He would sit quietly by a river, observing the interplay of life. These quiet walks were his form of research and spiritual renewal. He understood that to defend a place, one must first know it and love it intimately. His conservation policy was animated by a progressive-era faith in science and government's role in curbing corporate excess, but its heart was romantic. He spoke and wrote of the wilderness as essential for the American soul, a necessary antidote to the softening influences of urban civilization. He warned that to destroy the natural resources was to commit race suicide, a stark term underscoring his belief that a nation that wasted its land was wasting its future. In his final message to Congress in 1908, he convened a governor's conference on conservation, placing the issue squarely at the center of the national agenda for the first time. The quiet walker had become the most powerful advocate the American landscape had ever known, leaving behind not just parks and forests, but an enduring ethic that preservation is a democratic duty, and that in the untouched wild places, the nation preserves the wellspring of its strength, its beauty, and its sense of wonder. After the disappointment of his failed third-party presidential bid in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, now in his mid-50s, sought a challenge so physically demanding it would eclipse political defeat. He found it in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, on an uncharted tributary of the Amazon River known only as the Rio de Dúvida, the River of Doubt. This expedition, undertaken in 1913-14, was not a presidential tour, but a genuine journey into the unknown, co-led with the Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon. It would become the supreme physical trial of his life, a near-fatal confrontation with nature that served as a profound, reflective capstone to his career of strenuous living. The jungle was an adversary unlike any he had faced. The immense, green-walled river corridor was a world of constant, dripping humidity, swarming insects, and oppressive silence broken by the eerie cries of unseen creatures. Progress was agonizingly slow. The heavy dugout canoes had to be portaged around countless rapids and waterfalls, a back-breaking task in the dense undergrowth. Their food supplies dwindled, spoiled, or were lost in the river. They faced hostile indigenous tribes, disease, and the ever-present danger of the river itself. Roosevelt's spirit remained indomitable, but his body began to fail. A leg injury sustained while trying to prevent a canoe from smashing on the rocks became severely infected, leading to a fever that brought him to delirium. At one point, weakened by malaria and infection, he urged the expedition to leave him behind to die, so as not to endanger the entire party, a request his son Kermit and the others fiercely refused. It was in this state of extreme vulnerability, floating on a makeshift litter, that the man of action was forced into a state of deep contemplation. The River of Doubt offered no audiences, no newspapers, no political triumphs. It offered only the raw, indifferent truth of survival. He later wrote of the experience with a haunting clarity, describing the basin of the Amazon as a place where the little civilized man has done vanishes and nature replaces it. Here, his personal philosophy was tested to its absolute limit. The strenuous life was not a slogan here, it was the minute-to-minute reality of finding food, avoiding poison, and pushing forward. He reflected on his legacy, on mortality, on the vast scale of a world utterly indifferent to human ambition. The expedition was ultimately a success, mapping over 1,000 kilometers of the river, which was later renamed Rio Roosevelt in his honor. But the cost was immense. Roosevelt returned home gaunt, decades older in appearance, his health permanently broken. He carried with him, however, a hard-won serenity. The fire of his ambition was not extinguished, but it was tempered by the humility the jungle had taught him. He had stared into the abyss of his own mortality and had been carried through by the loyalty of his son and his comrades. The River of Doubt became the ultimate metaphor for his life, a treacherous, uncharted path navigated with courage, grit, and a willingness to face the consequences. It was his final great adventure, a journey that moved beyond physical exploration into the realm of the spirit, confirming his belief that the only life worth living was one spent on the daring edge of human experience, even if that edge threatened to cut you down. After the roar of the Amazon faded and the last political battles were fought, Theodore Roosevelt returned to the true north of his life, Sagamore Hill, the rambling, comfortable home he had built on the bluffs of Oyster Bay, Long Island. This was not a retirement in the traditional sense, for Roosevelt's mind never truly rested, but it was a return to the hearth, to the landscape of family and cherished routine that had always anchored his tumultuous existence. The large, multi-gabled house, filled with the trophies of his hunts, the books of his scholarship, and the echoing laughter of his growing brood of grandchildren, became his final command post and sanctuary. His days settled into a rhythm dictated by affection and enduring interests. Mornings were often spent in his book-lined study, the North Room, writing with ferocious productivity, history, autobiography, editorials on the looming war in Europe, his pen scratching across paper as the morning light filtered through the windows. He maintained a voluminous correspondence with friends, former rivals, and intellectuals across the globe, the letters serving as an extension of his lively conversation. Afternoons were for activity, though now tempered by the ailments acquired on the River of Doubt. Long, brisk walks through the wooded paths of his property replaced the rugged hikes of old, but were undertaken with the same purposeful stride. He would point out birds to visiting grandchildren, his ornithologist's eye still sharp, or pause to examine a tree or a rock formation with the curiosity of a naturalist. The heart of Sagamore Hill, however, was the family gathered in the evening. As dusk settled over the cove, The family would convene in the spacious living room, around the large stone fireplace. Here, in the flickering firelight, the former president was simply grandfather, or Theodore. He would read aloud, his voice expressive and warm, or he would be drawn into recounting tales of the Badlands, the White House, or Africa, the flames dancing in his spectacles as he spoke. These were not boastful monologues, but shared stories, part of the family's sacred mythology. Edith, his steady partner through decades of chaos and glory, presided over the scene with a contented grace, her needlework in her lap, offering a quiet comment or a knowing smile. The home was a living museum of a life fully lived, every object a prompt for a story, the elephant tusks framing the fireplace, the buffalo head on the wall, the well-worn saddle in the corner. Visitors, from humble local farmers to foreign dignitaries, were welcomed with equal hospitality, drawn into the circle of light and conversation. In these final years at Sagamore Hill, surrounded by the love he had cultivated and the land he cherished, Roosevelt achieved a kind of hard-earned peace. The fireside became a symbol of integration, where the boisterous Rough Rider, the shrewd statesman, the voracious scholar, and the devoted family man were all one and the same. Here, by his own hearth, the great river of his life slowed and deepened, reflecting not on future conquests, but on the rich, complicated, and purposeful journey behind him, its warmth lingering long after the final embers had turned to ash.